Who are you when you aren't sure of your purpose? When the world seems to not care about you at all? When you aren't wanted? Who are you when the world doesn't need you? The Longest Journey came out when I was 2 years old, and at the time, I loved it. Okay, obviously that's a joke, but I do find it interesting just how nostalgic I find this game, despite playing it well into my teens, like I have some sort of connection to it from back then. Despite my age, my first console that I really got into was the PlayStation 1, so I've never been a stranger to uncanny, off-looking CG cutscenes and hand-painted backgrounds that use perspective tricks to make their 3D characters look like they belong there. What blows my mind about my introduction to this series in particular is that the person that recommended it to me, the most unfortunate friendship I have ever had the misfortune of experiencing, told me to play Dreamfall: The Longest Journey, the second game in the series. I haven't played the first one, so I don't think you need to, he said. I should have known then that that person was someone I wouldn't want to be friends with, but I didn't know any better at the time. Now, I do. The Longest Journey trilogy, even if it doesn't seem like it on its face, is as much of a trilogy as any I have ever seen. The 3 stories contained herein are so inextricably tied together that it blows my mind that this person could have loved Dreamfall so much as to recommend it to me and not have wanted to seek out the game that explains who April is, why she matters so much despite being only one of 3 playable characters in the game, and that perhaps the least of the 3. When The Longest Journey came out, point-and-click adventures were already, by all reports that I can find, effectively dead. And just in case I'm wrong about this, then don't take my word for it, blame Ragnar Tornquist, the director and creator of the series. In an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun back in 2007, he says as much on the state of point-and-click adventures. The game was a bit of a miracle in this light, Funcom apparently supporting them even as they were going over budget and facing delays. It even started as a platformer, but when Tornquist realized the story that he wanted to tell, the genre had to shift to fit. I very much appreciate this, and I think it turned into a great game, and even more so, a great series. This video, as a result, is the first of a trilogy, looking at the 3 games in the series. I want to understand it better, how they connect, and how the characters evolve across. The discussion of the characters and events of this game won't stop with this video, because they don't stop evolving in this game. So what is this game about, for those that haven't played it? Largely, it's about dreams, the balance between logic and chaos, destiny and prophecy, and identity. The main character goes through an arc of finding herself and her purpose in the universe, only to seemingly lose that purpose right at the end. There's a ton of dialogue, but it's densely written, purposeful, and full of world building and meaningful interactions. And, oh yeah, it's got a cathartic, scathing indictment of late-stage capitalism that was 20 years ahead of its time, at least in my opinion. If this interests you, consider playing it, but be warned that it is somewhat lengthy and it does have a habit of, rambling. On a first playthrough, you likely won't see the purpose of all this, but I assure you, there's more to the writing than a first playthrough will show. This video will be mainly focused on presenting this density in a way that you will hopefully understand even if you haven't played it, but should also not ruin the experience should you decide to check it out afterward. We open to a comfy looking house lit by the flickering light of a fireplace. An older lady sits in a chair, and 2 unnamed individuals sit on the floor next to her. They ask her to tell the story of the balance, which begins where it ends, in a tower, in a realm which is no more. We then see a CGI cutscene, giving us a bunch of nonsense imagery which can't really be parsed at this time due to lack of context. I also can't show it because it straight up has a penis right in the first real cutscene of the game. I think this game set a land speed record for full frontal male nudity back in 1999, and no one has even tried to beat them. The most critical piece here is the shattering of some stone disc and 2 dragon shapes locked in a circular dance. One begins to consume the other. A man falls from this light and seems to leave this place. Then we see another CGI cutscene of a girl in her bed, before everything around her falls away and she's suspended in some sort of fantasy realm. Skyscraper-like mountains dot the landscape, and we stand on a sheer cliff face overlooking a valley of some sort. The beginning of this game is a dream, which, to the game's benefit, lends much of what we see here an air of ignorability. We're going to end up not really considering what's shown here for some time, as it's going to come and go and get sworn away as a dream. In it, this girl, April Ryan, meets a tree spirit and, much more importantly, a white dragon who calls April her daughter. After a puzzle and a conversation or two, this swirling dark vortex appears and knocks April off the cliff, prompting her to wake up back in her apartment. Welcome to Newport. Much of the initial chapter of this game is walking around, meeting the locals, and chatting about life in Venice, a small section of the major city, Newport, in America. April lives in the border house, run by a lady named Fiona. Across from her lives your common D-bag, who goes by Zach. Basically, the first thing he says to April is that they should do drugs and go dancing, to which April declines. April then heads downstairs and has a conversation with Fiona. This conversation is fairly lengthy, my recording of it clocking in at 20 minutes. We'll talk about the density and importance of the dialogue in the future, but two things are of import here. The first is that much of this dialogue is optional. If you don't really care about the origins of the border house, you don't have to listen to Fiona gab about it. The second thing is that the first thing is at least partially incorrect, because the game all but requires you to exhaust all dialogue options at certain points in order to move on, meaning the game will slowly train you to select every dialogue option available. This can be a problem if you're not interested in the story, but to be completely frank, if you're not interested in the story, why are you playing this game at all? All this game is story. The world building and characters and plot is all it has, and I'll tell you this now, so much of the dialogue is important in ways that you can't really even appreciate until your second time through. I've played this game a total of 5 times now and have logged 90 hours in it on Steam, and I can tell you that, to a certain extent, every playthrough of this game only got more interesting as I picked up on and understood more of the subtle and impressive writing present throughout. I have no doubt that another playthrough would reveal even more than this one did, but I have to stop somewhere, and 5 is the arbitrary line I'm gonna draw in the sand. April steps outside and meets a man who goes by Cortez. He's old, eclectic, and Spanish. He tells April she has a destiny, but April tells him to get lost. He talks about her dreams, despite her never having told him about them. Then he says something odd. "We didn't think you'd react this way." Interesting wording. April moves on and goes to her school, the VAVA, or Venice Academy for the Visual Arts. Venice was once an industrial complex, evidenced by the bizarre contraptions and aqueducts that are still full of mechanical runoff from that time. But nowadays, it's been converted into mostly homes for students and the homeless population of Newport. As you move in that direction, you'll be greeted with a sweeping reveal of Newport proper, a massive city with skyscrapers stretching into the clouds and the obligatory flying vehicles. This setting is thought out so well that even the flying cars are well considered and developed. We'll see that a good bit from now. This all makes Venice proper feel like a tiny little island in a sprawling city, but critically, Newport doesn't feel chrome. You know? Even just from this establishing shot, it feels a little run down and grimy. We'll see more of this later as well. April passes by numerous artists on her way to Vava, to which she can comment and give her thoughts on pretty much all of them. Being that this is a point-and-click adventure, this is a critical part of the gameplay, clicking on things, as 'twere. April will try to establish some of the details if you ask her to. When she gets to Vava, she prepares to get to work on a painting for a student exhibition coming up before getting interrupted by Emma, her friend since coming to Venice a couple months ago. Emma is a flirt, with a penchant for getting herself into unfortunate romantic situations, but she does impressive work with a hollow sculpture. Emma tells April that Cortez wanted to deliver a message to her, to find him where children visualize their dreams. April isn't sure what this means, but is sure that she doesn't care. Emma leaves and April starts working on her painting, but as she's making to leave, the hollow sculpture seems to take on a physical form and lunges out at April. I know this is a fairly simple and even janky effect, but when I saw this as a kid, it legitimately jump scared me. To be honest, there is a consistent and underlying sense of, I don't know, uncanniness in this game that makes these moments fairly effective when the game has you immersed. And it's certainly not the last time it's going to do something like this either. This moment pushes April to look into Cortez a bit more, her thinking that he might be able to illuminate her on why she's been seeing such strange things. Passing back through into Venice proper, we can take note of a cop accosting a couple skateboarders with a massive rifle. Apparently, skateboarding here is illegal, and the cops here are emboldened enough to openly wave and point assault rifles at people for what I would assume to be minor misdemeanors. A related bit of world building comes with the big clock in the center of this area. Apparently, there was a Venice massacre in 2109, about 100 years prior to the events of this game, in which a bunch of cops shot a bunch of squatters living in the abandoned industrial complex of Venice. This is all the context context we're given for this event, but it tells us something about the police in Newport at least. April then goes to see Charlie, who works at the Fringe Cafe with her. Walking in here, the mood shifts drastically. We're walking into a dark and atmospheric bar with this grungy sort of song playing in the background. You can walk deeper into the cafe and find a jukebox, which allows you to change the song. This to me implies that the music here, unlike in most of the rest of the game, is diegetic, and actually what people would listen to. So if you aren't a fan of dark, gothic trip-hop vibe tracks, don't go to any clubs in Venice, Newport in the year 2209. You may recognize the track Dragon, which is the default track that plays in the Fringe Cafe from some of my other videos. This is mostly because the vibes and atmosphere of it resonate with me so loudly that I think it lives rent-free in my head. Charlie is a kind-hearted guy, a pure optimist, and a dancer to boot. He and April both work at the Fringe on the side of studying at Vava. Charlie will remind April to bug their boss, Stanley, to get paid, as he won't if they don't. You have to collect the timesheet April stuffed in her diary, which you can pick up in her room back in the border house. This is one of the ways many puzzles in this game play out, inspecting items in order to collect other items. The game expects you to be thorough with just about everything you're given. Stanley will load up her cash card with some dough and ask her if she wants to work tonight because some other girl called out sick again. You can agree or deny, but the outcome is ultimately the same. April can find the poster on the wall above the jukebox to discover what Cortez probably meant with his message. April can also speak to Emma and a guy that does not matter named Marcus. Walking in on the conversation, they argue for a little while on the release date of a movie named Sidetracked, which itself is a stealth joke because they get sidetracked on this topic for a while, but anyway. April can ask Emma about Cortez, who says she finds him cute. April replies that he's 60 or something, and Emma says those are not the eyes of an old man. April decides to head to the Roma Gallery, which requires getting on the metro. She buys a ticket, which requires a gene scan, I guess in order to connect your identity with the ticket and perhaps to keep certain people off the metro. The scanner is sure to mention that genetic forgery is a federal crime. The metro is run by a company, Bocamba Mercer, meaning transportation, at least in this city of America, has been privatized. This is a crappy, rundown metro line that has been retrofitted with this new age technology gene scanner, and much of Venice looks and feels this way. There's also something called a free access terminal in the border house, which is apparently supposed to be an access terminal for the internet. What can I say? It doesn't get everything right. It wants April to purchase a voice interface module in order to more speedily navigate the internet with her voice, but she realizes that it's already got the voice interface, and the purchase is just to unlock the ability to use it to browse the web, which she clearly finds to be predatory. The Watertown Bridge location is in a different section of Venice, and there's no lack of people strung out on drugs and trying their best to keep some kind of rhythm to whatever song they're playing. In the Roma Gallery, we can see a few statues and paintings, and Cortez standing in front of a painting of something like a man and a woman in an embrace. He grills her on the meaning of the painting, created by a kid named Warren Hughes, saying that it is important, that it will leave a lasting impression on her. He then refers to her waking dream of the hollow sculpture coming to life. He says, there is both truth and illusion in dreams and in the images they create. The problem is in sorting the one from the other. You need my help in sorting things out. She refutes him, but he offers to meet again tomorrow. She declines, but he acts like she didn't and walks off. So let's take a moment here to look at things from a broader lens, starting with Cortez. He's clearly not entirely just an old man, but something a bit more important. Every conversation that April has had about him with others betrays this to some degree. Charlie says there's more to him than what he wants us to believe. Emma says those are not the eyes of an old man, and multiple people bring up his love for old black and white movies, including himself, calling any movie not from that era bad. To be clear, this game takes place in the year 2209, meaning the movies he's referring to are somewhere between 200 and 300 years old. This is actually a subtle clue at this time to his true identity. There's also a massive focus on dreams, many people citing strange events related to their dreams. There's an article, only available in the demo version of the game and accessed from the free access terminal, which lays out something called dream sickness, which is apparently plaguing people. It causes a lack of ability to tell waking life from dreams, sleepwalking and talking, and anxiety attacks or schizophrenia in those most affected, and Newport seems to be a hotbed for some reason. Cortez asks you to meet him at an exhibition where children visualize their dreams, and then you have a couple choices on what to do that night, but either way, you and everyone around you has a waking dream. Either you go to work at the Fringe and see this little creature appear out of the jukebox, which interestingly bears a striking resemblance to one of of the sculptures in the Roma Gallery, or you can go spend time with Fiona and her wife Mickey and watch a movie, during which a rainforest exits the screen and enters the room around them. Both of these events happen regardless of which one you choose to be a part of, and you can hear about the one you didn't experience from those involved in it. There's a pattern to both of these events, a piece of technology bringing about some kind of waking dream, which also coincides with the hollow sculpture coming to life. Others are having nightmares like April as well, notably Mickey, who is said to have had multiple and even woken up screaming in the night. Fiona informs you of other things she's experienced, hearing noises, the kind you're not supposed to hear in the city, and looking down into the canal water and seeing an underwater city. When you finally do go and meet Cortez in the Mercury Theater, a revival cinema in the Metro Circle in Newport proper, he presents you with a portal, a mirror to reflect your dreams, which should tell you all you need to know about what's on the other side if you've been paying attention. Before we step through the looking glass, let's take a moment to talk about the gameplay. I've already mentioned a few elements: interacting with and investigating objects placed throughout the world, and exhausting dialogue options. This is how most of the progress is gated. The timesheet is the most clear and early example, I'd say. Speaking of it, it's tucked away in April's diary, which she actually writes in throughout the adventure, giving her direct thoughts on events and primarily giving hints as to what to do next if you've forgotten. The journal is easy to find, but much more esoteric is the little toy Constable Guybrush in her closet, which is required for 2 puzzles, one which takes place a significant distance from this point in the game. This would perhaps be my first complaint with the game. As it continues, it becomes quite sprawling, with tons of places to go and items to collect, and it can become overwhelming if you miss any individual detail. It can be hard to find them in the future when they are necessary. We'll see a great example of this later on. Up till you get to the portal, there have been basically 4 major puzzles. The first is rescuing the egg in the dream world at the very beginning of the game. Since the scope is fairly small at this time, there's really only a couple things you can even do, so if the logic wasn't there, you could brute force it pretty easily. Luckily, this one is also fairly logical. You have to collect a stick and combine it with a dragon scale to create a funnel of sorts to redirect water onto the land the tree is on. The dialogue clearly telegraphs it, and the limited number of items make this an easy tutorial puzzle to introduce a few key concepts to you: searching for items, combining them with other items, and using them in the world to enact change and solve problems, as well as paying attention to the dialogue so it can lead you in the direction of the solution. Not every puzzle will do this well. Getting into the Mercury Theater is a huge puzzle which contains 3 or so smaller ones. First, dealing with this undercover cop, Frank Manelli. After exhausting all his dialogue, you'll learn that he wants a sweet after his super salty and oily lunch. You can pick up a candy from the French cafe and give it to him, but it doesn't make him go away. Instead, coat it with the kerosene under the trash can to the left of the cop, and he'll spit it out and run to the restroom, getting him out of the picture. All of this was so you could access the power box he was standing next to, which has a square keyhole. Thus begins perhaps the most infamous puzzle in the series. The key's location is obvious. It's in the metro station, sitting next to the high voltage rail, meaning it's unsafe to pick up by hand, and even if it wasn't, it's a bit too far to grab from the platform. So we need something rubber and a way to reach all the way down there, right? Great idea, except the fact that it's near a high voltage line becomes, to my estimation, irrelevant to the solution and only serves to misdirect, as one of the critical items you'll pick up is a rubber ducky. The fact that it's rubber is irrelevant, as it doesn't protect April from electricity in any way, and its actual purpose is independent of the material it's made of. The electricity is essentially just a way to show that April can't just climb down and collect the key, but this could have been framed in a way that didn't lead the player to think avoiding electrical damage was a key part of the puzzle, because it isn't. April must also collect 2 other items, a clamp and a clothesline, which is basically just a rope. The clamp is involved with a minor puzzle of fixing the plumbing issue at the border house, and in order to do it, you need to complete this electrical circuit using the gold ring you can collect from Fiona, which is clearly signposted if you pay attention to her dialogue. This mini puzzle is fairly simple. You just have to do stuff to the machine in the order you can, and then flip these switches in a certain pattern in order to be able to release the pressure and retrieve the clamp. You then take the gold ring back on your way out. In order to get the rubber ducky and the clothesline, both of which are outside the window in April's apartment, you have to drop some bread from the table in the Fringe Cafe onto this grate to make the bird go and try to eat the crumbs, thereby knocking both the clothesline and the rubber ducky into a position in which you can collect them. The bird needing the bread is signposted by April, remarking that it looks hungry when you interact with it. My major problem with this is that once you've done this, the clothesline falls into the water and becomes completely invisible. In order to retrieve it, you have to interact with the chain. Doing so causes April to pull the chain up and get the clothesline. If you perhaps didn't realize the clothesline was important, or better yet, didn't see the clothesline at all, then this would most certainly become a brick wall that would all but force you to resort to either clicking on every single interactable object on every screen until you luck into finding it, or look up a guide. This is an easily solvable issue of just making the clothesline hang on the chain in some visible way when it falls. So it's at the least a bit silly that this is how it was designed. The other problem I have is more minor, but it's just the fact that if you interact with the chain prior to knocking down the clothesline, nothing will happen. If April simply reeled in the chain and then dropped it back into the water when there wasn't a purpose, this minor problem would also be solved. I think the manner in which stuff like this is presented is extremely critical for point and clicks to get right, and puzzle games in general, I guess, as silly stuff like this can lead to a world of frustration for the player. In order to actually collect the key, you have to combine the clamp with the clothesline to make something you can drop down to the tracks. This clamp is one that closes when no pressure is applied and opens when pressure is applied, which is clearly demonstrated with its use as a pipe stopper back when you first found it. So the issue then becomes how to apply pressure to the clamp and then slowly release it as the clamp is lowered down in order to grab the key. The answer is the rubber ducky. Bizarrely, you can remove this band-aid from the rubber ducky to deflate it slowly and then re-inflate it by interacting with it with the mouth icon. Then combine that with the clamp and rope to get this ungodly contraption, which will, as the rubber ducky deflates, slowly release the pressure on the clamp and cause it to grab the key. The logic of this is mostly betrayed by the fact that it's a little unbelievable that the ducky could apply enough pressure to open the clamp in the first place. I honestly don't know that I hate it as much as most people do, but keep in mind that I've played this game 5 times, and on my 5th playthrough, I still got a little stuck thinking the solution was different than it was due to the rubber part of the rubber ducky, or forgetting to collect the clothesline because it literally becomes invisible. I think this puzzle has earned the poor reputation it has. Then you have to get into the fuse box and break the fuse in order to cause Freddy Melon to go and unlock the door to get into the alleyway. This is as simple as finding the rubber glove in Vava and combining it with the band-aid you already have from the rubber ducky so you can safely interact with the fuse box. Then once you're back there, you have to figure out a way to get through the fire door, which you can't open from this side. Setting the nearby trash can on fire with the matches you got from the border house lobby will cause the fire alarm to go off and Freddy to come out, but he simply puts out the fire and goes back inside, so you need to distract him somehow. The shadow on the wall looks a lot like a cop, which is signposted, and you can collect Frank Manelli's hat from the street, which was also signposted, and add it to the trash pile to make it look more convincing. Then, when wound up, Constable Guybrush says things like, "Put your hands up," so if you play that sound and then set fire to the trash can, Freddy will come out, think he's being arrested, and do a dance like Guybrush commands him to. This one is bizarre, but it's signposted well enough if you simply do trial and error that getting to the solution is reasonable. Some of these puzzles are fine, some of them are weird and illogical or otherwise require strange leaps in logic to get to the solution. Is a guide, strictly speaking, necessary? Absolutely not, but I do think that the game does make some weird choices that make it unnecessarily difficult to get to the solution to these puzzles, depending on the order in which you do things. The clothesline is the most obvious and perhaps most egregious example, but it won't be the last, and some puzzles later in the game, by my estimation, are worse than this one. Most of them will be much better though. What remains of this section of the game is to step through the looking glass into the parallel world of Arcadia. The existence of Arcadia isn't a secret to the player. Pictures of it feature prominently on the Longest Journey website, which is still there from 1998, just by the way, and the promotional blurb states that April has the power to pass between worlds like others pass from waking to sleep. So transitioning into this new world by way of a portal is not going to be a surprise to anyone that wasn't blocking their eyes and ears during the purchase process for this game. However, the nature of this world is a mystery to April and to the player. You have no doubt spent some amount of time luxuriating in fantasy worlds before, but I find that Arcadia is a wonderfully interesting example that sets itself apart, drawing inspiration from others but otherwise using its fantasy setting in unique and interesting ways. Stark, in contrast, is a believable approximation of futuristic Earth, so it's familiar in many ways. It even starts in a more condensed and archaic city in the form of Venice, which is even more familiar. This familiarity is what gives Arcadia the pop it needs. Despite knowing of its existence, the contrast creates the intrigue it needs to be exciting to explore and learn about. And boy howdy, will you learn about it. We'll get into more specifics later, but I just wanted to set this up because the mystery of coming into this place and seeing it for yourself is a critical part of its opening presentation. Also, if you hated what Final Fantasy XIII did with using terms and not explaining them until hours later, you're definitely not gonna like this. April appears in front of a bunch of murals. She walks to the right and finds herself in the presence of a man in a white robe. Trying to talk to him, he speaks in some bizarre gibberish. She can respond in a number of different ways, but in order to learn his language and proceed, the correct solution is to be silent and listen, and the magic of Naven, all tongue, will enter her mind and eventually she will be able to understand him perfectly. April eventually reveals that Cortez sent her here, and he responds by telling her to get to know Marcuria a bit. They step outside to a wide establishing shot of the tower on the left and a market of stalls in a courtyard below. The primary goal of this section is to learn about Marcuria and Arcadia as a whole, and to meet the people that will be central to some puzzles later. So let's take some time to explain some of the things we learn in this section. First and most important, the balance. The balance is the name given to, well, the balance between Stark and Arcadia, science and magic, order and chaos. The balance is overseen by the Guardian, an individual in charge of controlling the flow of science and magic so that things don't fall out of balance. Every 1,000 years, the Guardian would be replaced, and currently we are on the 12th Guardian. A long time ago, around 12,000 years as would have it, Stark and Arcadia were unified, and magic and science were in harmony rather than separation. At some point, humans began abusing the power of magic and science, and so the Dryad Kin, which is Naven for dragons essentially, decided to split the worlds apart, one of pure science, one of pure magic, Stark and Arcadia. There were 13 Sentinels of the Balance, those in place to be protectors of the balance and of the Guardian. 6 of them went to Stark, 6 of them went to Arcadia, the 13th was the Dryad Kin, 2 of which went to Stark and 2 went to Arcadia. A group known as the Vanguard, made up of the Sentinels that went to Stark, are currently aiming to tear down the divide between the twin worlds and reunite magic and science. At this time, there is no Guardian in the tower, and so the Vanguard are aiming to put their own puppet Guardian in place in order to break down the barrier and reunite the worlds. Pretty much all of that information is given in one giant conversation between April and Sentinel Vestrum Tobias Grenset, the first person she meets when she gets here. This conversation also gives the basic idea behind April's goals going forward. In order to stop the balance from failing, April needs to 1. Collect 4 pieces of a disc which acts as a key to the Guardian's tower, 2. Collect the 4 jewels in the possession of each of the Dryad Kin which completes the disc, 3. Find the entrance to the Guardian's realm which currently no one knows where it is, 4. Find the current Guardian and take him back to his throne to open the tower, 5. Make sure the Vanguard doesn't place their own Guardian on the throne. I'll speak on April's opinions on all of this in a bit. At this time, just be aware that April isn't exactly gung-ho about all these expectations being placed on her. So far, this discussion has been focused entirely on the world, or rather worlds, April inhabits, and has thoroughly ignored her and how she feels, but it's an obviously critically important element to look at, and so we will later. Marcuria, this massive sprawling city, is full of lots of different people, though we only meet 5 individuals throughout this visit. They do largely run the gamut, I think, of the population of Marcuria. There's the cups merchant that isn't even sure Stark exists. Important to note that this is far from the majority opinion. Unlike in Stark, where Arcadia is completely sworn away as nothing but dreams and fairy tales, in Arcadia, Stark is known to exist and is spoken of in somewhat reverent tones. The maps merchant across from the cups merchant is an example of one of these. It's free of chaotic, unpredictable magic, and machines are the future. This man is disenfranchised with the Sentinels and how Arcadia does things, thinks they are living in the past. He also believes that Stark and Arcadia shouldn't be separated anymore. There's an old sailor that mostly tells us anecdotal tales of dubious validity. There's a younger sailor, a follower of the Mojal, who can't sail because there's no wind, apparently due to an alchemist named Roper Clax. And oh, of course, there's a talking bird that doesn't have much to say at this time.
Get me out of here!
The reasonable impression that this gives is that Arcadia is massive, full of political interest, and there's more to it than the game can realistically show without it being 100 hours long. There's a few reasons for this. Terms and place names are used without explanation, which when there's 10 or so of these for every conversation gives the sense of scope and grandeur. April doesn't offer any thoughts because, she has none. This lack of explanation makes sense and further carries the mystery. Every new person or interaction gives more questions than answers on any given topic, which again is likely how you would feel if you too were dropped into an unknown and fantastical world. I think this is a wonderful presentation of a strange and complicated world, and it's only going to get more interesting as the story goes on, in my opinion. More will be explained, but much more will be given as well. Now, just before coming here, Cortez told us to find a man by the name of Brian Westhouse when we wanted to come back home. In order to find him, you have to ask the locals, in particular the map merchant, but it won't be enough to know his name. He is known in Arcadia by the name the Rolling Man because he rides a bicycle everywhere he goes, and people in Arcadia apparently find it outlandish. Tobias Grinset knows about this alternate name, but in order to get it, you have to ask him the same question twice. This is a great example of how what seems like it should be a duplicate conversation reiterating your goal is actually required to progress, and the game is training you to exhaust all possible dialogue options whether you care to listen to them or not. For a game that is so singularly focused on narrative and dialogue, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing, but it is important to take note of. Knowing this information will enable you to begin making map deliveries for the map merchant, and your first is to Captain Horatio Nevabe, the young sailor we met previously. He will require us to get a flute and play it while he writes his name on the signature list because the Mojal apparently gets mad when his followers write their signature. Bizarre, but okay. You purchase a flute from the stall just outside the gates leading to the docks and play it for the captain as he writes so the Mojal is distracted. This flute will play multiple roles throughout the game. Once that's done, the next delivery is conveniently a map to the Rolling Man himself. The maps merchant proceeds to give a frankly hilarious beat-by-beat set of directions for how to get to his house way on the other side of the city, but once he's done speaking, the map icon just appears in a comical way. Interesting to note here is that if you follow the directions visually on the map, it actually makes sense that the directions would lead to where it ends up being, which is a nice touch. Brian Westhouse is a man from Stark. This is a unique circumstance, shared only by April that we know of, and so his presence here is an immediate mystery, though the game actually does give some answers for this one. Brian knows Cortez, but not by that name. He knew him as Manny Chavez, and the last time he saw him was in the winter of 1934. The astute among you will notice what April notices as well. This makes both of them over 300 years old. Something critical happens here though. Brian explains that time doesn't matter in between worlds in the land of dreaming, which Brian spent some amount of time in before landing in Arcadia. Yet, he specifically says he's sure Cortez doesn't look a day older than he did back then. So Brian went through the land of dreaming where time is fuzzy, but Cortez didn't since he's still in Stark, meaning that Cortez has to be at least 300 in Starkian years. This isn't clearly spelled out, but it's a massive hint to Cortez's true identity, going along with the more subtle hints we talked about earlier. When April brings up going back to Stark, Brian says he isn't sure he can help, but as she turns to leave, he remembers that Cortez gave him a pocket watch on which he said when his heart started beating again, he would know. He gives it to April, and she can fix it with the pushpin she got from removing the pink note that you used to get the gold ring from Fiona. This causes the pocket watch to start ticking, and a portal, a shift, appears. April offers to bring Brian back home, but Brian says that it would be a journey he would likely not survive. Before leaving, Brian warns her not to let her curiosity allow her to open another shift. April steps back through the portal, back to Stark. Cortez is waiting there when she arrives. The conversation they have is mostly to reinstate the goals April now faces, though there are a lot of critical lines here that will come back up later. Cortez says April is a child of the balance, the key to fighting chaos, and something else, but he stops himself from speaking further. A new idea presented here is that of chaos, a physical being that is wreaking havoc in Arcadia, and another goal of theirs is going to be to defeat it, though chaos also describes a more conceptual parallel to logic and order. April is clearly important, clearly a primary player in the events to unfold, but she is reluctant, saying that she's just a girl, just me. One thing we know from this section of the game is that April is what's known as a shifter, someone who can open a portal or shift between the twin worlds and travel freely between them without the trouble that Brian describes. This is one of the things that makes her a potentially critical element to saving the balance. But the other stuff that Cortez says is a bit more esoteric, unspecific. A child of the balance, the key to fighting chaos. Cortez also says, just by being alive, you're fighting chaos, which, is a bit odd. Cortez also says that April has a choice, to involve herself or not. When April says, what if I say no, Cortez responds by saying that he's not able to see the future, something else would happen instead. Despite April's base instinct, she decides to join Cortez in trying to save the world. This conversation, in many ways, will be the basis for the themes present in the rest of the game. It is the fulcrum from which the rest of the story pivots, and April is, of course, key to it all. The next day, April searches for the Vanguard. She heads to a new location and, oh, look, it's Zach. One thing that I forgot to mention is that April promised Zach she'd go on a date with him in exchange for info on the Mercury Theater in order to find Cortez, but she stood him up last night. He is very not happy, and this surprisingly matters a lot more than you'd think it would a ways down the line. Anyway, April heads to a new area of Newport called Hope Street, a seedy and dangerous neighborhood. She goes into the cathedral and meets a Catholic priest by the name of Father Raoul. Raoul points her in the direction of Warren Hughes, the same person that painted the art that Cortez rambled on over a couple days ago, when April asks of him at the behest of Cortez. Warren is a troubled kid, but ends up helping her when she mentions Cortez, but for a price. He wants his information cut from the records, and to know what happened to his mom, dad, and most importantly, sister, who were shipped to the colonies not long ago. The colonies, so you know, are a bunch of space stations that are run by the various megacorporations of Earth. They apparently force you into certain jobs, and April describes it as slave labor in disguise on more than a couple occasions. Warren tells her that she can break into the Newport Police Department archives to get the information that he wants and that she's looking for, so she obliges to break the law. So this begins the multi-step puzzle which takes us through Newport, learning more about it and how it functions. For one, the police are privatized, owned and or funded by Bocamba Mercer and Bingo Corp. Trash, for some reason, has funneled through the police department. My only assumption on this is that they go through the trash as a form of reselling old junk people have thrown out, but there's no real way to know why they do this as far as I can tell. At one point, April steps into a news bulletin being given by a reporter in front of a crashed shuttle. The writing of the report is extremely manipulative and emotional, and the outburst the woman has at the end reveals the media is entirely focused on ratings above all else, turning the tragic death of dozens of people into a show to tug at people's heartstrings and manipulate people into continuing to watch. In case you don't know this is perhaps a slightly hyperbolic version of what our current reality is like, so if you needed to hear this today, major news outlets are not reliable and are full of agendas and falsities in an effort to keep you watching. The cop standing guard around the shuttle says that crashed shuttles are a dime a dozen. April says that they are advertised as the safest way to travel, but the cop explains that this is because being hit by one as it comes down is actually pretty unlikely. This tells me two things. In the future, false advertising will get to the point where, as long as a statement you make is true in at least one meaning, it's not false advertising. And technology is progressing so quickly and intensely that safety is being forgotten in the interest of progress. The cop also, when April flirts with him to try to get him to leave, says,
"Sorry, man, but I'm gay. Now, move along."
So by 2209, homosexuality is destigmatized, it seems. April stows away on a trash truck and makes it into the police station proper, since the front door was out of order. April asks to go into the back area, but since she doesn't look like a cop, she isn't allowed in. Notably, the telltale signs of a cop in this world are their uniform, badge, and pistol, meaning that the pistol has become so ubiquitous as to be considered equal to badge and uniform as a form of identification. The door to go into the restricted area is also busted, and the union working mechanics are so well taken care of that they are able to extend their lunch break indefinitely due to indigestion. In order to force them back to work, you have to collect multiple requisition forms, one for suspension of union workers' benefits and the addendum that covers weekends. Ironically, even once they are back to work, they still don't fix the door. You have to do that part yourself. They just open the panel. Once you're inside, you can, and should, purchase a soda from the bingo machine. April remarks that they are the only soda left standing after the soda wars of 2159. We get absolutely no info on what this war was, but it explains why Coke and Pepsi aren't still kicking. We run into our old pal Frank Manelli, who is on the can. This is either a continuity flub, or Frank has been on this pot for somewhere around a full day or so since we poisoned him yesterday. Either explanation is believable, honestly. You have to look at the nearby lockers to find a female name to say that you are. One Maria Hernandez, who we learn has been having an affair with Frank without his wife knowing. We get him his stomach medicine and end up stealing his prosthetic eye, replacing it with the eye that fell off of Constable Guybrush. Here's another wonderful example of how sprawling and terrible these puzzles can get. If you didn't collect the eye from Constable Guybrush, you would have to go all the way back to the alleyway where you left him, pick him back up, then interact with his loose eye twice in order to receive it as a usable item. This, again, would be an absolutely insane thing to realize if you hadn't before placing Guybrush down to complete the puzzle with Freddy Mellon, and I would feel really sorry for you if you found yourself in this situation. Anyway, we steal this prosthetic eye in order to fool the retinal scanner that blocks the way into the archives. I wonder if this technically counts as genetic forgery.
Did you do something illegal?
Not yet. Not really.
The inside of the archives provides us with a bit more information on the state of the MPD. The archives are housed on a computer that would be ancient by today's standards, much less in 2209. I guess they are lucky that they have this machine that finds and collects physical evidence for them. We discover some things about Warren in the archives and collect the data cube, which supposedly has info on Jacob McCallan, the head of the Church of Voltec, and thereby the Vanguard. Warren is gracious enough to give us a contact with Burns Flipper, who would be perfect to give us further help with this data cube, which needs to be decoded. And so we head to another new area of Newport, an old shipping dock that is currently defunct. We knock on the door 3 times like Warren tells us, and Flipper comes over the intercom. Let's briefly discuss the voice acting on display here. Pretty much all of it is extremely high quality, especially for a video game of its time. Burns Flipper shows evidence of the way the lines were handled by Ragnar Tornquist. He waited to write most of a character's lines until he had a feel for the voice actor and the way they were going to portray the character. Flipper's VA in particular went off script regularly and definitely had way too much fun with the character. Here's the best example where you can see the subtitles differ from the line given.
You still got credit from the AG unit you gave me. Works like a charm, I'll tell you, baby. It's hot. I can float like the wind. Does. Eat with 2 people on at the same time. Oh, yeah.
I don't want to know that.
The VA for Crow, a character we'll meet later, is the same way, regularly going off script to ad-lib some nonsense, and a lot of it works well. The Flipper decodes the data cube for us, and we see a couple videos. One of Jacob McCallan giving a speech to some people, inciting them to some pretty vague change, and one of a person named Gordon Halloway, who Flipper says is cold and purely logical due to some experiments the Church of Voltec did on him when he was young. He's apparently been split in half, 1 part logic and 1 part magic, but Flipper isn't entirely certain what that means. In order to get to the Vanguard's headquarters, April will need a fake ID to get up to Grindle Avenue, the upper crust of Newport. Flipper could make one for an exorbitant price, or you could provide him with an anti-grav unit. The puzzle to collect this little anti-grav unit is another example of how sprawling the puzzles can become, for the worst, if you miss even one little detail. Here's the items you need. A shard of mirror from Frank Manelli's locker, which you will have due to needing it to get this far in an indirect way. You will need this screwdriver laying on the ground in the police department lobby. This one is a bit hard to miss because of how visible it is, but it's still quite missable. You need a soda can from the vending machine in the police department I mentioned earlier. You also need to have both realized that this random innocuous looking machine outside of the Flipper's warehouse is a paint shaking machine, and you have to use the soda can on it to shake it up so when you give the soda to the cop in order to cure him of his incessant cough, it explodes on him, forcing him to leave the premises. And again, if you miss even one part of this, figuring out how to accomplish this puzzle can be a massive exercise in frustration. We give Flipper the anti-grav unit, and he promises to make us a fake ID so we can go to Grindle Avenue. It'll be ready in a few days. April goes to bed and a shift opens. April accidentally stepping in and being forced back into Arcadia. April finds herself in Marcuria, outside a building called the Journeyman Inn.
Though it really should have been the Journey Woman.
Sorry, man, but I'm gay.
She heads inside and crashes a party, meeting the proprietor of this establishment, Benrime Salman. She's an older lady with what seems to be a storied past. The casualness with which she states that she bought this place using the money earned from traded wine and slaves is indicative of Arcadia's views on slavery at the very least. Benrime says that this is the Feast of the Balance, a festival held every year, usually for multiple days and in the open, but due to the growing influence of the Vanguard, they are having it for one day and behind closed doors. That's some great world building, showing that the game is able to actually consider what a war on the very fabric of people's belief system would look like, and how it would affect the people's day-to-day lives, as well as their customs and traditions. I appreciate that this game is willing to slow down and take some time to see things from a lot of different perspectives, the Sentinel, the working class, and even non-human races before too long. One thing of note here is that the music in this case would also be diegetic, meaning that the only music in the game that is in-universe is in what are essentially the 2 parallel universe bars, the French Cafe and the Journeyman Inn. April spends some time here before meeting an individual by the name of Abnaxis. He's a member of the Vanar, a race known for their acute sense of time, or perhaps more aptly, lack thereof. His bizarre method of speaking, mixing past, present, and future tense like a grade schooler that newly acquired the ability to write, betrays how his people experience time. The Vanar don't perceive time linearly. Instead, they can see the end from the beginning and all possibilities. They can see all possible futures, and can even see pasts that did not come to pass. Unfortunately, Abnaxis can't see beyond what he calls the Veil, which is an unusual phenomenon for the Vanar. He invites her to his house in the morning, and April ends up going. He speaks of a prophecy. The balance will falter, weakened by the assault of chaos and its servants, but a savior would come to restore the balance, only to break it. Abnaxis ends up giving April a good bit of info on where to go and what to do next, and April goes to what is essentially a library and spends some time reading. There's a few books here that aren't necessary to see, but I think that all of them are fairly interesting, and the ones that are required give April info on how to accomplish her goals. This entire section of the game, as April searches for the Dryad kin and the pieces of the stone disc in Arcadia, is about prophecies, and April fulfilling them, multiple of them. She rescues that talking bird from the cups merchant and gives him back to the old sailor, who puts him back in the chest he sits on, in order to pull a favor with Captain Horatio Neverbay, who said that women can't sail at the Mojal's demand, so she is allowed to sail with them. However, she also then needs to travel north to Riverwood to deal with Roper Clacks in order to free the wind so they can sail toward an island called Elias, on which is a people that tell stories and are April's best bet at learning about the Dryad kin. As she travels, the talking bird appears and starts following her and helping her, and she calls him Crow, after a comic book character she loved as a kid called Crow Boy. April can call Crow down with the flute from earlier in order to enlist his help with things. She meets a little mole person, less offensively known as a Banda, named Ben Bondu, and ends up rescuing his brother from a creature called the Gribbler. Here's your nightmare fuel for this video. In doing this, April becomes April Bondu Mbata to the Banda, a prophesied individual who would rescue their people from an evil creature to save the Banda, only to then end up tearing the world apart. This is the second prophecy so far that has involved a saving event followed by some vague cataclysmic event later. And this one April has already fulfilled, right? So when does the second half of that come into play? Before she leaves, April receives a piece of the stone disc from the Banda, 1 down, 3 to go. Through a series of events and decent puzzles, April comes face to face with the dangerous Roper Clacks. April says that it'd be unfair to challenge her to a duel because she'd lose, so she offers a different test. April presents him with a calculator that she won from the cups merchant and challenges him to a math quiz. Roper Clacks apparently doesn't really understand math, but she uses the calculator, thereby winning the challenge. This is certainly moon logic, but it doesn't bother me too much because there's only so much you can even do at this point in the game. You're bound to stumble upon the answer eventually because the options are so limited. Roper Clacks asks to see the calculator and ends up getting sucked into it for some reason, defeating him outright and allowing April to head up the tower. This is bizarre to say the least, but there's actually some explanation for why this might have happened. It just doesn't come until about 5 minutes prior to the game ending. April brews a bunch of potions out of a book at the top of Clax's tower, all of which she will continue to use in multiple situations going forward. She frees the wind, the souls of the people Clax had captured, and the tower floats back down toward Marcuria. April heads back into the city and speaks with Tobias again, and Tobias tells him what he believes her destiny is, to become the 13th guardian of the balance. He then hands her a talisman of the balance, a powerful magical artifact. April is understandably taken aback by this. The fate of someone destined to become the Guardian is one of great responsibility and great uncertainty. They must stay in the tower for 1,000 years. When April eventually would return to the land of the living from the land of dreams, her world would be completely different. Her friends would be gone. April decides to continue on as she processes this, getting on the White Dragon and sailing toward Elias. At one point, a chaos storm forces them off course, lest they be shipwrecked. April uses her newly acquired talisman to redirect the magical compass so that they continue to head toward Elias despite the captain's orders. The storm begins to overtake them, and when the captain realizes what April has done, he locks the talisman in a chest under the deck and tells the navigator to correct course once again. April tries to get the talisman back by knocking the lock off with an axe, but she ends up punching a hole in the ship instead. This, combined with that chaos storm, causes the ship to sink. According to Crow, everyone made it out alive on a lifeboat, but April is left stranded on some wreckage at the command of the captain. While Crow goes off to search for the nearest dry land, a creature from underwater grabs April and pulls her down to the bottom of the ocean. This underwater city belongs to the Merum, a race of merfolk that gather a substance called Tanyen, a green algae-like substance that glows and provides light and warmth to the surrounding water. April is dropped in this pocket of air and must figure out how to both breathe and speak underwater, two tasks which the Merum have prepared for. Doing so makes April a gatherer, essentially a slave to the Merum who must go and collect Tanyen, but through a series of events, she ends up fulfilling a prophecy instead. She becomes the Water Stiller, though the Merum Queen is admittedly quite confused by this. The requirements to fulfill the prophecy of the Water Stiller are to come to the Merum by providence, take something that they have kept hidden, bring light to the darkness, slay a Snapjaw, and reunite their people and end their strife. April ends up doing all of this, but the last one is a head scratcher. Their people are at peace, at least according to her. While April is fulfilling the rest of the prophecy, she learns that the Merum and the Elation, the storytelling air dwellers that live on Elias, are actually one and the same people, but they are at war currently, so April believes that it is her job as the Water Stiller to reunite the Merum and the Elation. Briefly, Let's discuss the puzzle that reveals this information, in my estimation perhaps the worst puzzle in the game. You collect these 4 3-sided stones and then swim up to this pedestal. The puzzle is all about the symbols on the rings and on the 4 sides. The 4 stones must be placed in the 4 slots in a certain order, which can be a bit confusing on its own. The left and right sides will always be facing their corresponding symbol, and the outside side will either be facing the symbol they are closest to or the one adjacent to them. That last part doesn't really matter though, as long as the symbols on the left and right side match up with what's on the left and right of that stone, it will work out. But it does cause confusion for sure as you try and work it out. The main problem though comes in with these rings. This guide I found says that the solution is for the rings to be in line with their opposites, but let's look at the correct solution. Fire and water, those are certainly opposites, so that tracks. Spear and pot are not really opposites, rather they are both tools, I guess, at least in my estimation, but the pot ring is locked in place already, so it's a freebie anyway. You would think that, if the intention was to telegraph that they are supposed to be opposites, that the ring that is locked in place would be the one that clearly signposts the relationship. One-Eyed Pyramid and Merum is, well, I have no idea what that relationship between those would be. Finally, bird and fish, at first blush, do seem to be opposites, but according to the lore of this world, which I just brought up, the Merum and the elation are actually one and the same, making them not opposites. The only saving grace to this puzzle is that the number of solutions are so low that it's possible to brute force and get there with relative ease. I think the main reason people don't talk about this one nearly as much is simply because it isn't bad in a funny way, it just doesn't have any internal consistency, so it's a bad puzzle but not in any interesting way. April heads up to Elias with the help of the Merum. Getting into the elation village is a complicated process that involves one of the best puzzles in the game, which can be solved simply by taking notes and paying attention. I like this one a lot, but there's really no sense in explaining it because it would take a while, and despite what some people think, videos this length can actually be concise despite their duration. April crosses a pit using some of the potions she made earlier in order to get into the Elation village, which puts her on the path to becoming the Windbringer, the Elation's prophesied individual who would come from outside of their people, fly on the wind like they do, and learn of their stories. The Windbringer is a herald of what is basically an end times prophecy for the Elation as well. The god that brought them to this planet, which yes, also means that the Elation and Merum are aliens on top of being bird and fish people, at least according to their personal lore, will eventually rise up and take them away once again. April listens to the stories of the Elation people and then speaks to their leader, the Teller, who understands that she is indeed the Windbringer. April explains that they must reunite with the Merum in order for both of their peoples to survive, and the Teller agrees. So April sets up a meeting between the warring peoples at a location that, at one point, was clearly a shared city between the Merum and the Elation. They agree to a reunification, and they both give their piece of the stone disc, 2 halves to make a whole piece, so 2 left. April is then carried down to the bottom of the ocean once again to meet the fabled god who fell from the sky, the one that is said to have brought the Merum and the Elation to this planet, the Blue of the Dryakin. This conversation is packed with information despite its relatively diminutive length, but here's a couple things. The Blue says, "I know who you are," to which April says, "Who am I then?" He says that answer was given at the beginning of her journey, but it is only now you know the question. He gives April her first jewel, of which she needs 4 to complete the stone disc, 1 from each of the kin. He says he's sending the Dark People to collect her, a race that has been brought up a couple times throughout the adventure.
But why didn't you send the Dark People to me earlier? You could have saved me a lot of time and hard work.
You are afraid of time and hard work.
No, but it's the principle of it, isn't it?
No, it is not. You had prophecies to fulfill. You had a purpose. Bringing my children together in preparation. This was important. And for that, I thank you.
April then is dropped off on a ship belonging to the Dark People, and she is called a Wave, an individual that pushes people and things toward change. She receives the Dark People's piece of the stone disc and a star map which should show her the location of the Guardian's realm if she is able to interpret it, and they take her back to Mercuria in the morning. The place is dark, and the Chaos Vortex appears, but a shift opens and she goes back to Stark, in the Hope Street Cathedral. If I had one major complaint for this section of the game, it would be that it feels rushed. I left out a good chunk of it in this recap, but most of what I did was simply pushing the narrative forward. What I'm missing is a bit more extrapolation on these people, these new races we get to meet. The Bondar are an okay example. We get to meet a few of them, they throw a feast in honor of the one who saved them from the Grippler, and April gets a spiritual experience that we'll talk about in a bit, a custom for the Bonda. The most glaringly obvious obvious example of the opposite is the Merum. The Merum Queen is literally the only one we meet, and we know nothing about their people effectively, besides that they need 10 yen to live because it brings good harvest. This city in the distance is massive, but we never see any other Merum doing anything, or any other Merum at all for that matter, not including these two that pull her down to the bottom of the ocean, just to be clear, which makes them feel like an afterthought and not up to the standards of the exploration other peoples and places get throughout this game. The Elation fare better, but not by much. There are only a handful of them sitting around in the city, all of which you can talk to and most of which you must talk to. They aren't really doing anything besides guarding the bridge into the village and the door into the teller's chambers. Their stories are interesting, and I like what the teller says about the art of oral storytelling, but the whole thing still feels a bit undercooked. The Merum and Elation have a parallel prophecy, but beyond that and their shared need for 10 yen apparently, they don't seem to share much history. I think it would be cool if we had to learn stories from the Merum people as well, and we learned throughout the process that the Merum stories and the Elation stories parallel each other in clear ways alongside their prophecies. As it stands, they don't really feel like they have a shared ancestry. While a section like this should feel like it's really fleshing out the world and making it feel larger, I find that it, in some ways, makes it feel smaller, because the credible facade that there is a larger and more complex world beyond the one we are confined to is beginning to slip in this section due to the issues. That being said, let's move along and track April's journey to its conclusion. April runs into Father Raoul in the cathedral and learns that he's a Sentinel Minstrom. April asks him about his beliefs, to which he says, belief in the balance and belief in God are not mutually exclusive. The balance had to be created by someone, right? While I don't know if there is a God in the universe of The Longest Journey in the way we understand the term, I do appreciate the care taken in the writing process to consider what a Catholic priest might believe about something like the balance. And yeah, the balance was created by someone. The lore of Arcadia tells us that it was the Dryad Kin, but then the question would be, who created the Dryad Kin, I guess? Can they die? There's a lot of questions to ask about this world, and the impression that much of the game gives is that the writers would have a solid answer for you if you could just pry further than the game allows. April heads back to the border house and finds Emma, with Fiona crying on the couch. Emma tells April to run before a man walks down the stairs. This is Gordon Holloway, the Vanguard's little experiment, a man made of pure logic, completely devoid of magic, cold and emotionless. Holloway is searching for the things April has, the pieces of the stone disc. Despite April offering to go with him, Holloway decides to shoot Emma anyway. When Mickey walks in and distracts everyone, April runs up the stairs and into Zach. The brief conversation they have reveals that he sold out April as revenge for standing him up, which I, and I'm sure many other people, thought was going to be an inconsequential story beat, but turned out to be quite critical, and I appreciate that. That being said, he says they promised no one would get hurt, so I guess he isn't pure evil anyway. Zach gets shot as April runs past and into her room. She jumps out of her window and lands in the murky liquid below, eventually ending up in front of the Fringe Cafe. Holloway's goons give chase, and April looks to be cornered before the mystery door next to the Fringe opens up and April runs inside what appears to be a shift. April ends up in the house of the old lady we met at the very beginning of the game, the one who is purportedly telling the story. She tells April her name, the Lady Alvane, and that this is a place unlike Stark, Arcadia, or the Land of Dreaming, known as the House of All Worlds. April was destined to escape from Holloway because that's how the story goes, apparently. She says that Charlie and Emma blame her for the pain that they are going through and for not telling them the truth when they confronted her about it a few days ago. She encourages April to continue with her mission, and when April says, "Maybe I'll see you again," she says, "I'm most certain of that." April leaves through another shift to Marcuria. It's a ghost town, on the brink of attack from the Tyran, but a few people remain. Abnaxis is still in his house, waiting for her to appear, and gives her the Venar's piece of the stone disc, his final act before returning to his people. April goes to the library once again and speaks with Minstrom Yaren, who helped her with the books before. He tells April that Tobias was murdered, but that the Minstrom are planning on staying and defending the library along with anyone else that should stay and fight. April uses this forge to finish the stone disc, and then, after seeing the encroaching Tyran army, accidentally opens a shift and heads back to Stark. April appears in the art studio at Vava, which is surrounded by Holloway's agents. She decides to try what Lady Alvane said about learning to use her talents. She paints the scene that she saw in her dream that started this whole journey, and a shift appears, taking her right there. The White Mother, the White of the Kin, is dying, and her replacement is about to be born. Before she does, she gives April her jewel and says that she is her daughter, reiterating what she said at the beginning. She dies, and a new white dragon appears from the egg, April's sister. April, using her newfound control over her shifting abilities, makes a shift which takes her back to the Hope Street Cathedral. Just in time to not need to shift anymore, really. April grabs the fake ID that the Flipper had made for her and heads up to the Vanguard headquarters past Grindle Avenue. The upper crust of Newport literally live on top of the seedy, disgusting underbelly. What we see of Newport proper reveals that the streets are dangerous, full of druggies, disgusting, and unwelcoming. What I said earlier about Newport not feeling very chrome is true until you get to Grindle Avenue, a street in the canopy of the city which you literally need a certain kind of ID to get into. Here, the streets are clean and white, and you can, of course, join the colony projects by simply walking up to a desk and signing your name on a dotted line. The people up here dress more future punk, I guess you could say. You don't see anyone hopped up on drugs up here because, like in real life, opiates are distributed to those that need to be distracted from their grim and unfulfilling reality. At least those on Grindle Avenue have a hope in this world and a cozy bed to go back home to. Many of those in the streets underneath them have nothing at all. Those in power stay in power while those underneath them stay consumed by drugs and unable to do anything about their situation. It's clear that the mega corporations that run the world at this point care nothing for them. This is totally speculation, but there's a decent chance these companies are the ones distributing the drug, Rapture, to the underbelly of Newport. They like when the masses are controllable and don't challenge them on anything. In case you need to hear this today, it's the same in 2025. Mega corporations would sell your rights in an instant if they thought it would improve their bottom line, and don't you forget it. After getting past Jerry at the front desk,
Gerald.
Sorry, man, but
April heads up the elevator into this office area. After rummaging around for a moment, wouldn't you know it, Jacob McCallan appears right in front of her. The following conversation with McCallan is rife with foreshadowing, and it becomes imminently apparent that both Jacob McCallan and Cortez are not all that they seem. April comments that he looks like he's 60, which echoes a comment she made about Cortez earlier in the game. McCallan also has the 2 remaining dragon jewels, and when asked how he got them, he says he has had one of the jewels for ages, the other came into my possession only a week ago, which lines up with when Cortez was captured. April ends up giving McCallan the key item she is carrying and then is set to be tortured by this strange creature so that she'll spill the beans on the location of the Guardian's Realm entrance. At this point, she doesn't actually know where it is, but Flipper is decoding the star map the Dark People gave her. She manages to escape the beast but nearly falls off the tower, but Cortez appears to rescue her. Cortez explains how he was captured, a small army and Gordon Holloway, of course. He reiterates that the Chaos Vortex in Arcadia is his other half, a being of pure chaos and magic. Jacob McCallum walks out and he and Cortez have a heated discussion, and if it hasn't become clear to you by this point, this conversation and the events succeeding it will confirm that Jacob McCallum and Cortez are both dragons. They end up falling off the tower, and April notices the pocket watch, which Cortez said was his heart, stops ticking, causing April to assume that Cortez dies in the fight. She goes and retrieves the now complete stone disc with all 4 dragon jewels and makes to leave. She goes back to the Flipper to get the map, but he's been shot. He also sold out April because they promised to give him his legs back, essentially, but he regrets it, gives her the map, and then dies just before April leaves. Finally, April gets on a shuttle headed to the Morningstar colony in space. While here, she discovers that Adrian, the former Guardian, is here, and she needs him to get into the Guardian's tower to become the 13th Guardian. There's a brief but fairly straightforward puzzle section here before she and Adrian get to the Guardian's realm. Inside, a few things happen. Adrian warned April that there would be 3 trials given by the realm to determine if you're worthy to set foot in the Guardian's tower. During these trials, she manages to capture the Chaos Vortex using a bind magic potion and the Talisman of the Balance. She deals with her daddy issues by forgiving him for being abusive to her, and she crosses an impassable gap to get to the tower proper. The tower doesn't seem to want to open for her, but Adrian assures her he needs to be here because he's technically still the current Guardian. They go up an elevator into the tower and briefly discuss what this choice means. If there was another way, I'd embrace it, April says, but she steps forward into position, ready for the tower to receive her as the new Guardian, but nothing happens. April is not the 13th Guardian. Gordon Holloway shows up once again, and after a short conversation, April uses the Talisman of the Balance on him in order to rejoin him with his Chaos half. He becomes a whole person and seems to lose his cold, emotionless edge, thanking April for doing that. Side note, this is what I said sort of explains how Roper Klacks is sucked into the calculator, and the hilarious implication here is that Roper Klacks, seemingly a being of pure and powerful magic, was created in Arcadia at the same time that the calculator, a creation of pure logic, was invented, that they are 2 halves of the same coin. Perhaps this also explains why he's so terrible at even basic math. His logical counterpart got all the math skills and he got none. Anyway, April says something interesting here. If I'm not going to be the Guardian, Who am I? Holloway says that he doesn't know, but that he's sure the universe isn't done with her yet. He also thanks her for stopping the Vanguard, for making that sacrifice. April says she did what she had to do, and Holloway says that that's more than most would have done. She then says,
Right now, I'm only concerned about what's coming next. Where do I go now? Where can I go?
Adrian instructs her on how to get back to Stark, or Arcadia, and she leaves to let the passing of the torch take place. As she walks away, she remarks,
So that's the end of that. Funny. I feel almost melancholy, despite everything that's happened. I'm actually gonna miss this adventure. After all, what am I doing now? Going back to school? Live like nothing has happened? Like I'm just a normal person? Well, it's a long way home. I'll figure it out before I get there. Wherever there is.
She then walks on into whatever comes next. The epilogue, picking up where the prologue ended, reveals some things as she tells the two unnamed individuals how the story ends. Gordon Holloway was the last Guardian, and the twin worlds were reunited during his reign. After they leave, Crow walks up, aging and gray, and they reminisce about their adventures. Crow asks for the story of the young warrior princess who single-handedly won the War of the Balance. Lady Alvane says that she doesn't remember it exactly that way, and then begins to tell the story before the credits roll. As with basically any story in a point-and-click adventure, it's told almost entirely through dialogue here. While some criticism can be levied at a few of the conversations for being a bit overbearingly long, I believe praise is also due for how dense and purposeful most of the writing is, not to mention its quality. The foreshadowing present throughout the dialogue is wonderful and makes repeat playthroughs feel worth it despite knowing where the story is going. Let's point out some examples. Fiona, when speaking on the name of the border house, says that she believes they are on the border between two worlds, Venice and the city of Newport itself, but also two more abstract worlds, art and spirit, science and technology. This is said before April goes to Arcadia for the first time. Fiona doesn't fully comprehend the meaning of what she's saying, but the parallel is clear. The hollow sculpture that Emma made is a Merum person, and one of the kids in the Roma gallery made a sculpture of a Banda mole. No doubt both of these were given to them in dreams, and they replicated what they saw. Fiona references an underwater city, also referring to the Merum. Much of the foreshadowing is obviously focused around Cortez and his true identity as the Red Dragon of the Dragkin, but some of the foreshadowing is more subtle than others. The fact that April calls Cortez and Jacob McCallum both 60 years old in appearance can't be ignored. There's a physical parallel between them due to their shared heritage. Emma saying that Cortez's eyes are not the eyes of an old man is also a clue, as well as the subtle clue we discussed of his love of revival cinemas. The game doesn't even really state clearly that these movies would be 300 or so years old at this point, making it one that the player is rewarded for thinking outside the box and knowing the world a bit. He loves those movies because he saw them as they were coming out. Speaking on Stark and Arcadia themselves, there are some parallels that I really appreciate. Despite having a common origin to Stark, Arcadia was discounted as mere dreams that many people shared, that many people wrote into fictional narratives, but dreams nonetheless, considered wholly unreal. Arcadia became the subject of fairy tales, dragons, underwater civilizations. These things can't exist, right? It's too outlandish, too mystical, too magical, too illogical. The logical mindset says that something like that could never exist. This is obviously meant to mirror our own relationship as a world to the idea of high fantasy and fairy tales, but it makes sense, even in a universe in which we know for a fact that Arcadia and those fairy tales are real. Many people in our modern day, even if presented with concrete evidence of the existence of, say, mermaids, would never believe it because it's too fantastical and illogical. Not to mention, I think there's a propensity for us to decide that if we hadn't discovered it by now, it probably doesn't exist at all. A completely faulty mindset, but one I understand nonetheless. It's easy to fail to realize that the world is way more complex than we as humans will ever fully comprehend, much less the worlds beyond this one, and we are arrogant to think we will ever fully know it. I have to imagine this sensation would be even stronger in 2209, another 200 years into the future, when mental barriers preventing us from understanding that there is more to this world than we could ever know are even more deeply set. On the other hand, Arcadia knows of the existence of Stark and speaks of it much more commonly. Some people, like the Cups Merchant, doubt its existence, but generally, Stark is just taken as a given in Arcadia. This, I believe, is because magic allows allows for the imagination to understand when things that seem otherworldly are actually real, despite them not making total sense or being intangible and unseeable. This speaks to the faith many people have in Arcadia. There are all kinds of religions in Arcadia, not unlike our world, but in Stark, religion is losing ground. People are losing faith in what they can't see, as it's becoming easier and easier to focus wholly on logic, reason, and what's right in front of your face. It's hard, in a world in which you can have anything known to exist appear at your fingertips, to believe in things that you can't see. But for those living a life like the Arcadians, that faith in something you can't see is much easier to come by. I think the idea of balance is an interesting one in light of this. Stark and Arcadia, within themselves, are falling out of balance to my estimation. Stark is so logical, so technological, that it has lost faith. It's lost the magic that drives faith, belief, and imagination. In contrast, Arcadia is losing the logic that protects its people. When we find Arcadia, it is wrapped in what would certainly be a cataclysmic event were it real. An alchemist has captured the wind, so no ships can leave port, no commerce can take place. Logic needs to keep magic in check in order for them to work, and the twin worlds are losing their sisters so thoroughly that things are devolving to a point of turmoil. It makes you wonder, to some degree, if the Vanguard were right about some things. Are the worlds meant to be separated? With logic and magic together, humans abused the power it gave them, but without them together, without them in balance, the world slowly fell to their biases, and the people were no longer protected from themselves and from the forces around them. Perhaps this was happening because the Guardian wasn't controlling the flow of magic and logic, but these changes I'm seeing don't just crop up overnight. They are systemic, they build up over time. And according to the end of the game, the worlds were reunited within 1,000 years of this game ending. What was the reason for this? Did the Sentinel finally recognize that 12,000 years of tradition doesn't take precedence over the needs of the people and the worlds in the present? I don't know. Thankfully, this isn't the end of the story. There's much more to be seen. On a slightly different topic, I find the representation of future America in Stark to be complex and compelling. On top of what we've already been over, there are so many details and moments that reinforce the idea that April is not the center of the universe, and not everything was placed here to serve her narrative. The world exists around her, without her, and she just inhabits it. This is difficult to pull off, but it works here in my eyes. Getting into some predictions, because anytime you write a narrative that takes place in a future version of our world, you're making predictions. The mega corporations that run the world now do so openly and without veil like they do currently. There are still people allusion to the idea that corporations don't run the world today, but it seems that by 2209, it's become widely accepted as normal. There's still a government to some degree, but it seems to have less prominence overall. The media is more corrupt, more manipulative than ever. This is already happening too, and many people are still under the idea that news media is somehow beneficial to us as a society, but things certainly seem to be worse in 200 years. Interestingly, Bingo Corp is a straight-up monopoly, being that they literally killed their competition in a war of some kind. However, since corporations now run the world overtly, monopolies are no longer a concern, and in fact are a goal, no doubt. The Church of Voltec is, itself, a major religion run by a massive company. A pizza machine on Grendel Avenue was shut down by something called the Department of Biological Warfare. I have no idea what that would be over, but it's interesting that it exists. While it doesn't get everything right, notably it didn't predict the rise of personal devices that had constant access to the internet, I think it is surprisingly close to what our world would look like even in less than 200 years, presuming we even survive that long, considering the major elements of it are already in place. And, keep in mind that this was written in 1999, so I find this to be impressive. Most of the world building of Arcadia is focused on the many different races you come across. While I'm not super versed in a large amount of fantasy, I find many of these to be compelling and unique to what I'm used to at least. The Venar are especially interesting as a people that perceives time in a way that is wholly unlike ours, so much to the point that they don't typically interact with the other races because the knowledge they possess is too powerful. Abnaxis says that this is willed by the Guardian himself, as time itself is also something that must be kept in balance, and the existence of the Venar itself could throw that balance out of whack were they to use the knowledge they have to enact change in their favor. There's some somewhat interesting political stuff with the North, South, and Mercuria in the center of it all, and some of the races, particularly the Bonda, have interesting customs, but I actually find a lot of the facade of a well-conceived world in Arcadia to be a bit lacking. There's not enough time spent developing these peoples to really make it seem like there's more to them than what we're given. I think Arcadia is ripe with potential, but the game doesn't really bring it out much, unlike Stark, which it does a great job of giving that reasonable impression of depth beyond what the game tells us. So I'm going to repeat myself with another word added on at the end. Who are you when the world doesn't need you anymore? April runs the ring from being unneeded by anyone, to being the most important person in the twin worlds, to being back to a nobody, unneeded, with nothing to go back to. So, who is April? She's an artist, a girl, strong and independent, someone with past traumas that she runs from. She's also the water stiller, the windbringer, April Bandu Mbata, a wave, the daughter of the White of the Dryad Kin, and, to a point, she and many others thought she was to be the 13th Guardian. She's important. She's needed. The worlds wouldn't have survived this onslaught from the Vanguard without her. But did she have to be? One critical aspect of this story, and truly this series, is predeterminism. Predeterminism is a philosophy which states that the events that play out were set in stone at the creation of the universe. Some versions believe that even the actions of humans are predetermined, but I don't think that's the take that Longest Journey has. In this game, the story is set in stone. Lady Alvane says as much. There's nothing April or anyone else could do to change that. But, on the other hand, Cortez says that prophecy cannot unravel the will of an individual. So, is this a contradiction? Well, I'm not so sure. Cortez is right. If April decides not to go on this adventure, to sacrifice of herself to save the Twin Worlds, something else will happen. As far as the game is concerned, on a meta level, choosing not to accept Cortez's offer to join the fight for the balance will result in, well, nothing happening. The game freezes until you play along, essentially. Some may see this as a necessary way to make sure that the game's story actually plays out, but I'm not above the idea that this was placed here deliberately to be a metatextual example of what happens when people's wills don't line up with the story as it's been predetermined. To prove this, let's talk about Dreamfall Chapters for a moment. Dreamfall Chapters is the most recent and likely final installment in the Longest Journey series, and it's evolved a lot from this first iteration. One critical evolution is the inclusion of choices and consequences. The game actually makes a big deal of how much the choices you make will shape the narrative around you. So how does this line up with the idea of predeterminism, that the story is actually set in stone? Tornquist had this to say in an interview with The Clickist. In Book 2, one decision you make very early on is an obvious example of this. Kion can decide to join the rebels or reject them. One option leads to the end of the world, with no way back. You either quit the game for good, or you make a different choice. This may not be the most subtle comment on predetermination, more like a thematic sledgehammer, but we want players to understand that the game world has a will on its own, and it's going to impose its will on the player characters. Later, he says, we're still bound by the greater story, however, or at least our characters are. There's no escaping the pull of destiny. So on the one hand, Tornquist here literally states that the characters can't escape destiny, that the greater story must play out as it's been determined. But that doesn't stop the characters from being able to make those choices and changing the world around them in ways not determined. The story just responds in kind by abruptly stopping until you play along. I don't know if I can say that this is really a contradiction or not. It's perhaps a bit confusing, but let's get back to April. April, in the intended path of the narrative, ends up fighting for what she believes by going through these trials, unwittingly stumbling and fulfilling multiple prophecies along the way. Yet, the only prophecy that was predetermined, the identity of the 13th Guardian, she couldn't fulfill because it wasn't hers to begin with. The rest of them could have, theoretically, been fulfilled by nearly anyone. The only expectation for the Banda, Merim, and Elation is that the one prophesied would not be from among their own people, and even then, only the Elation states this directly. The rest are a bit more vague on the subject. So then, is there anything that consists of April that makes her a necessary part of this story? Obviously she is a shifter, but is that all? Why does she go through all of this trouble, hard work, just for the world to throw her away? Perhaps you might think she has to. On the one hand, in our hindsight, she did, because the game says so, but to April, I don't believe that's the case. Cortez tells her that she doesn't have to, and she decides to anyway. Despite saying that she couldn't possibly step back into normalcy with the knowledge she now possesses, she very much could have done so, but she didn't. So why did she? I think it's because she wanted to be needed. She wanted to be wanted. She wanted to be important. April, at the beginning of the game, is a nobody, and she feels it. She's a broke, starving artist with a few friends and no future. She's just another face in the crowd that no one cares about. The Banda people tell her to sleep in their spirit dig after she saves them from the Gribbler, and she has what they call a Bakbar. The spirits of the Banda people speak to her. They speak in two forms. The first is the dark truth, when you're unsure. The other truth is the opposite, which you must see in order to be happy. Both are true, but one instills fear and uncertainty, while the other is a goal of sorts. The dark April, representing the dark truth, says some critical things of April during this Bakbar.
There's no point subjecting the entire world, two worlds, to your feeble attempts at redeeming yourself, is there? Oh yeah? Like you really believe that? Like you give a shit about those people? You're doing this for yourself, April, and that's why you're gonna fail. Shut up! Shut up! That's always your way out, isn't it? Telling people to shut up when they speak the truth and shutting them out when they're getting too close for comfort. Hey, don't tell me I do it because Daddy hurt me. Screw that. How do you think you're gonna hold up when this job gets tough if you can't rely on anybody or believe in anything?
I'm doing it, aren't I?
Yeah, because what kind of choice did you have? Face your problems back home? Face the nightmares? I don't think so. So you run, and you think you're putting distance between yourself and your fear of the past and the present? All you're doing is running straight into an inevitable nervous breakdown. Like right now. You're talking to yourself, April. Now, that's not something a mentally stable person would do, is it?
When April finally gets to the ultimate moment of her journey, all belief in the world, all evidence pointing to the idea that she is the most important person in the universe, she is at peace. She's scared, but ready to do it. She said in her diary that she is getting used to having a mission, a place, and a purpose, and this is the ultimate culmination of that. She says, if there was another way, I would embrace it. But would she? Because when another way does present itself, when she learns that she isn't actually the Guardian, you know what I see? I see her world crash, her sense of self disappear. She's distraught that she's not the Guardian, despite just saying that she'd accept an alternative were it given to her. There is an inherent selfishness in April, the sense that what she's doing truly is for herself, for her own benefit, so that she feels better about her place in the world, and nowhere is it more clearly laid out than in one of the last things she says before leaving the Guardian's tower. In this moment of destiny, of the passing of the torch, and uncertainty filling the air, this is all April has to say. I'm only concerned about what's coming next. Where do I go now? Where can I go? April, in this moment, as in every moment, is primarily concerned for herself, who she is and what she's supposed to do. The universe gave her an identity, and she accepted it because it meant she was wanted, she was needed. And now her purpose is fulfilled, her job is done, and the universe casts her aside so that someone else can ride her coattails all the way to the top of the food chain and take her place as the most important person in the world. And April isn't concerned for whether Holloway will be a just guardian. She's concerned with what she's supposed to do now. And she walks off, feeling melancholy, hoping she figures it out by the time she gets where she's going. She walks back into nothing. Her friends are angry with her. She has knowledge she can't share with anyone in her home without sounding crazy. Her experiences mean nearly nothing. She's perhaps even worse off than when she started. Now, she has had a taste of importance, a taste of being the center of the universe, and it leaves her wanting. So, who does she become now? Well, unfortunately, that's a question that we'll have to wait for next time. This discussion is incomplete, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on your outlook. Despite coming out nearly 7 years later and focusing mostly on a different main character, Dreamfall: The Longest Journey is a direct continuation of this game, and many of the threads and themes presented here continue there. Some discredit this game for its unsatisfying ending. I can't imagine feeling this way, and I can imagine what critics would have said about the ending had it ended the way it was foreshadowed to throughout, with April becoming the 13th Guardian. Predictable, by the numbers, and formulaic. The Longest Journey's ending, to me, is so much more than that. It destroys your expectations to the point that you feel like April does as she walks away. It's supposed to be inconclusive and unsatisfying, yet it also isn't finished at this point, and I do wonder if any of those critics went on to play Dreamfall and saw what is a more conclusive end to this game's narrative, though it's debatable that Dreamfall may have an even less satisfying conclusion than this one. I like stories that end like this because it feels more real, I guess. Real life rarely gives you satisfying conclusions, and even when it does, you can't stop there like a narrative does. You have to step back into your life, whatever that means for you, and continue on in the wake of the story that has played out. It can be difficult to come back from that, so I'm glad the next 2 titles in this series explore how someone might react to an unsatisfying conclusion to their life's narrative. With that being said, thanks for watching. This video was supported by the members of the channel. Those at the 2nd and 3rd tier got access to this video a week early, and those at the highest tier get access to extra videos. This time, I'm looking back at my Control video, which, funnily enough, has a parallel to this game that surprised me when I went back to rewatch it. Those at the highest tier also get their name read out loud, so check it out. Ivan Chicharo, forgive my pronunciation on that one, Shuckles the Destroyer, P. Bizzle, Roxas 180, Quez BT, Mastro Chef, OMFG It's Justin, The Monkus, and Josiah Keen. Thanks to these people for supporting the channel.
Sorry, man, but